And it's just there's just so many things like increasing renters protections, which I understand. I'm not advocating for landlords to be able to kick out their tenants for no reason whatsoever. But let me just say that if you make the lives of landlords more difficult, then there's going to be less landlords because like people who are thinking about maybe renting out their space, it's going to be like, oh, I'm afraid I'm going to get a bad tenant. I'm afraid that my tenant's going to stop paying rent and I won't be able to kick them out because of these eviction protection laws and all this stuff. If you make the lives of landlords more difficult, then they might decide not to be landlords. And you say, oh, that's great, we want less landlords, right? Because landlords are the devil. It's like, no, you don't want that. You want more landlords, because the more landlords you have, the more houses there are available for rent. If you have less houses available for rent, what do you think happens to the price of those leases? Right, they go up. So yeah, it's just all the budget is just a big disaster, and it goes to show that the fact that they thought this budget would increase their poll numbers, it's just another like it's just the final nail in the coffin to show how disconnected the liberal government is with the everyday Canadian person, with the average Joe, right? So, yeah, I mean, it, who thought this was like who thought this was a good idea, right? Like they seriously thought that it would increase their poll numbers. Like Tristan, oh, why don't you comment on that? Like
Yeah,
what's going through their minds and stuff?
I just want to jump in here also with regards to the real estate stuff, like the landlord protections, etc. Like, you realize people will hoard houses, right? Because this is Canada, where you buy a house on Monday, and by Wednesday the house seems to have appreciated $10,000, right? Like, I'm exaggerating, obviously, but it's not really unreasonable to expect that if you buy a house in a high increasing city, you could conceivably be just seeing massive, like, 20% increases in value every year. And if, you know, all you have to do is hold the property to get that gain, and maybe that gain is sufficient, that why am I going to risk renting it out and having the all these having a bad tenant that just messes everything up? Like, if I'm going to take that risk in a scenario where I'm already getting all this value from appreciation. If you change the rules a lot, I think that there'll be a lot of people who just like, well, maybe I just won't rent it out then. And I think that there's often an argument about, like, oh, then we should tax those people who have the vacant housing more. But that's also not necessarily going to solve the problem either, because the housing market is still appreciating a lot. So even if you're taxed more to have it, maybe that is just still cheaper than renting it out to you, right? And so I think that there is a bit of a concern on that front to take. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have renter protection. I'm just saying that there is a bit of a market that you have to consider, and Canada's housing market is a complete mess on that front. Anyway, to get back to the government budget, yeah, I can't really believe that. I'm really surprised that they released this budget and we're expecting like a positive response. There's clearly some stuff that in there that I think would appeal to their baseline people who tend to vote liberal. Um, but I don't think that there's not enough in there to really drive home to those people that this is still the right choice um, for people who've been voting liberals. And there's definitely nothing in there for people who are on the fence and are like, oh, should I do the conservative? Should I do the liberals? Should I vote NDP? Should I throw my vote in the garbage for the Green Party? Right? Like, if they're sitting there on the fence, there's nothing really in this budget that I think you're looking at and going, oh yeah, that is going to solve a lot of my problems. That's going to really help me. That's really going to be an important aspect to my future. And that's something I wholeheartedly agree with. There's very few like stuff in there that is even remotely in that realm. And because of that, I think that everyone who is kind of more so on the fence is like, this is, if it's kind of garbage, like I kind of know what their plan is for the next 5 years or whatever. So if my options are between picking them and having this clearly garbage plan, or picking the conservatives and having maybe a garbage plan, maybe I'll just risk it for the biscuit for the conservatives, right? And the people who might have been on the fence, and I think that's part of why there's been that divergence, is the people who are on the fence might have been like, yeah, I don't think that this is going to work out for sure on the liberal side. And I think that I'll risk it for the biscuit because, you know, by releasing a poor budget, the amount that you're risking it for the biscuit actually drops. Because if you know for a fact that you're looking at a trash tier budget, right? On one hand, you got trash tier budget on this hand, and you've got a maybe trash tier budget on this hand. Well, we know that the trash tier budget is trash. So this budget needs to be not that much better to be better. And the likelihood that I'm going to roll the dice on, you know, instead of maybe if they released a really good budget, I'd be like, oh, there's like a say like a 30% chance the conservatives could release a better budget. But now that they've released a bad budget, it's like, okay, well, this budget is so bad that there is way a way lower chance that they're going to release a worse budget, right? So, you know, a lot of people would risk it for it.
Bad budget sounds like a rapper's rap name.
for bad budget.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with it. It's like a loot box, right? It's like a it's like a mystery box in a game where, you know, you have like a shitty weapon, but then let's say you can give up the shitty weapon and open this loot box, and there's like a 30% chance that you get like a really good one.
Mm-hmm.
So you're probably going to go for the loot box because like
you've got less to lose, right? Like it's not like you're looking at like an amazing future and trading that up for your chance at a good future. You're looking at a shit future with a chance at a better future. And because you're kind of looking at the shit future, you're just like, well, I'll roll the dice on it, boys. Can't be worse than this, can it?
and let me maybe elaborate on, like, you know, what you said about real estate and like the renter protection and like, you know, how you know, potentially Canada's headed down a shitty future. And I do think that the reason is just like everything that the Liberals have done so far that I could see is, you know, moving in the direction of eroding the rights of private property. And I say this because let's say if you know, buy a second house, right? If you want to rent it out, then they're going to make that process more difficult if you get a bad tenant, if you want to evict them, right? So it increases the bar to be a landlord because you're going to have to, you know, maybe have more legal resources to hire more lawyers to, like, you know, take care of a tenant in case you get sued or something, right? And their law is like, you know, heavily biased towards the renter side. So that's one option. Or another option is you buy a second house just to kind of maybe store your value against inflation because inflation is really bad. Well, then they're going to tax you for having a vacant house, right? So it's kind of like death or exile, right? Like if you choose death, it's death by exile. So like you're dead either way. And it just like the government just doesn't want you to have a second house, right? And like maybe I can already hear the arguments. It's like, oh, why do you need a second house? You're just trying to like hoard money. Like, listen, we can't be fighting over the scraps, right? Because, you know, like rich people have more spending as well, right? They make more money, they generate more economic activity, and they go out and they build businesses and services and produce products that we use every day. And, you know, if you encourage business, you get more competition, and that's just how the economic machine works, right? But if you drive out like all the rich people and you say you can't have a second house or you can't have private property, then we're just fighting over the scraps, and what ends up happening is that the rich people leave and they take their money with them, and then and then we end up with an even smaller pie, right? So it's just, let's not fight over the scraps of the pie. Let's think about how to expand the pie for everyone. And this is what I've been advocating all along. And this is the exact opposite of what the liberal government is doing right now. And for that reason, I think that they should be voted out as soon as possible.
I think I
Yeah.
think also on that front, just to jump in here again, the fact that um we're not going to get rid of landlords in general, but if you make it basically impossible for your average person to become a landlord for an investment purposes, and obviously I think there've been arguments made that like houses shouldn't be an investment. Unfortunately, the simple fact of the matter is they are currently an investment. So you're whether or not they should or shouldn't be is irrelevant. They are one. But anyway, just to loop it back to my original point, though, if you make it really hard or difficult for your average Joe to buy a second house and rent out the second house as an investment property, then and they choose not to do it, that investment property is not going to be going to someone else like a normal person to go buy it. No, a rental company will buy that property, like a big corporation will buy that company and then rent it to you. And guess what? Guess who will be much less accommodating? Guess who has the legal resources to throw at, all these throw at potential problem tenants? All these, you're basically, by encouraging this, it kind of leads to more consolidation in the rental market. And that's not good for anyone, because if you have one company or a few large companies that are determining the rental prices, then they can set prices a lot higher than they need to, because they need to generate a profit. They've got shareholders that they need to support, right? That they need to provide value for. That's their job, is to provide value to shareholders, right? But if you're a landlord yourself, as you with your second property, you're not necessarily trying to make a profit off of it. You're going to set your prices at a different rate than necessarily a corporation are. And if you're, a good landlord, I'm not saying every landlord is good, but if you're a good landlord, then, you can work with your tenants to ensure that it's a good experience for everyone as much as it can be, right? Like they get value from you handling all of the maintenance and everything to that effect. And, they get that, like they get the house, they get the place to stay, right? So like it can be a relatively beneficial relationship, and it's not the same situation as with a company and an individual, because if I have like an issue as like a tenant, where I can't pay rent this month because I've lost my job, and I need surgery, so I can't get a new job, right? A local landlord may be willing to, if you talk to them, they may be willing to go, okay, you can delay rent or take a month off or whatever, and like you guys come to an agreement on how you're going to handle that, right? Whereas a company landlord is probably just going to replace you with a new tenant, because they don't really care. They've got shareholders, they got profit margins, they got stuff that they need to do, right? Like they have people that they are accountable to. Whereas a local landlord is going to be a lot more, on average, a lot more willing to work with a tenant, I would say, at least in my experience. So I think it's a really risky strategy to drive out local landlords, and that's functionally what you're going to do in the long run, because they're the ones who can't afford the legal costs. They're the ones who are taking a larger risk by taking on a bad tenant, right? So I think it's a risky maneuver on the part of the government. So you could potentially result in less people who are offering rental properties, or you result in companies becoming the rental companies, becoming the rental where you have to go to rent. And they are definitely not going to be the cheaper option, I would say, at least in my opinion. That's kind of my
Yeah, and
spiel.
also, like, I think if we keep going down this path, we also risk like an issue with squatters, right? So I believe a couple of episodes back, we also talked about certain states in the U.S., especially blue states, right? Like sensing a pattern here, right? It's the left-leaning states, of course. Like again, not trying to be partisan, but this is just what I've noticed, right? And what a lot of people have noticed is that these left-leaning blue states like Washington State or New York, they have issues with squatters where they have these laws that basically protect squatters, because when a squatter moves in to like a property that's vacant, if they stay for more than 30 days, apparently they're considered a tenant. And then there's like a whole legal process that the landlord must go through before that person can be evicted, right? And that process can take a long time. And during that time, you're not allowed to evict the person until a judgment from a court has been handed down, right? So, you have these people just trying to look for $1 million houses in New York or in Seattle or whatever, and then they just, if they find one, they just move in, and then there's nothing the landlord can do about it. The police won't help them because technically, like, the law is not like on the landlord's side; it's on the squatter side, right? So I haven't heard of that many similar stories happening in Canada. I'm sure like it's probably happened somewhere, but it's not a widespread issue in Canada yet. But that's what I'm afraid these policies are pushing us down like that path, right? Where if you increase like renter protection too much, you risk getting like people who are not paying rent who essentially become squatters, right? Let's say you can start off being a renter and you can start off paying rent, but then you just decide to stop for whatever reason. And a lot of people, like, if they find out that, hey, like, if I stop paying rent and the landlord can't evict me, then why would I pay rent, right? I'm not saying that like most people will do this, but certainly some people would do it. And then they would stop paying rent and then they become a squatter. And then you can't evict them because of these laws. So yeah, that's just what I'm afraid is going to happen in Canada too. So yeah, your thoughts on that, Tristan?
Yeah, I mean it's possible. It's currently I don't think our squatters' rights are as strong as in those blue states. I think there's more limitations on squatters' rights, and that's why we don't see it quite as much. But I think that there could be a risk with the rental rights. But again, I'm not saying we shouldn't have some rights. I'm just saying that that it's a balancing act. You need to find that point where the renter gets a good amount of rights and the landlord isn't put in a position where the landlord doesn't either want to risk renting it out or is having to raise prices and be very picky about who they rent to um, because of their requirements to ensure they have a good tenant, right? So I think that's another factor. Just the whole, like, if you're a landlord and you have to be really picky about who you're going to rent to, that's going to result in you being more specific and more determined and being like, maybe I don't want to rent to this person because they, I don't know, seem like they aren't showing a high enough income or something to that effect, right? And which then makes it harder for people who are, lower income, who may be perfectly fine at paying the rent, but makes it harder for them to find and get the ability to even get a rental, and maybe they'll be paying more or something to that effect. Like it's a really big balancing act that they need to find the sweet spot for. And I think the rate at which they move in Canada, I feel like the ability to find the balancing act is a little concerning, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
My opinion on this is very simple, right? And this goes back to what I said earlier about private property, is that we need to ensure that private property is respected in this country, if we want to maintain order, right? Because let's say if you buy a house, you probably sign a mortgage on the house unless you're super rich and you somehow manage to buy a house in Canada with cash, which pretty much no one's able to. You probably sign a mortgage, like you're paying that mortgage for the good part of the rest of your life, and you probably had to volunteer a big down payment, had to put forth a big down payment to get that house in the first place. If somebody can just walk into your house and stay there without paying you, without you signing an agreement with them, or they sign an agreement and they violate that agreement and they're not paying you, then you should be able to call the police and remove them from your property. That's just plain and simple, right? Because it's your property, you paid for it, you're supposed to have control over it. And if somebody disrespects that property, then we have laws that will enable the police to remove that person from your property, right? And I think that anything that violates that, what I just said, is a bad law and disrupts order in society, like what we've seen in New York and in Washington State and in certain other blue states in the United States, right? So yeah, and I think that's obviously, as I said, it disrupts order in society, and that's you know it's an existential crisis. It will become an existential crisis to the country if taken to the extreme, right? Like if you just let it play out, where if nobody respects private property, again, like what we said about a couple episodes ago about like the police telling you to leave your keys by the door so that if a person breaks into your house to try and steal your car, they could easily grab the keys without you having to fight them so that they can take your car more easily. Again, that's also another example of how private property is not respected in Canada, right? Because you paid for that car, presumably, right? And the fact that somebody is allowed to just walk into your house, grab your keys, and take your car, and the police is not going to do anything about it. And in fact, the police is encouraging you to make life easier for the criminals to take your car. Like, it's just total disrespect of private property. And once you let that go, everything goes, right? Because if you're not allowed to own anything, like if you buy a car, you have to share the car with everyone. If every like person who didn't pay for the car is allowed to just take it and use it whenever they want. If you buy a house, somebody is able to squat in your house whenever they want. Like anything goes. Why would you go to work? Why would you make money? Why would you just do anything productive? Because you're not allowed to own anything. You're not allowed to own the fruits of your labor, right? And I think that's essentially like that's communism, right? Just to put it plainly. So yeah, final thoughts, and then we got to move on.
I think private property is pretty important, because I think we need to be able to own stuff. You need to have a reasonable expectation that people aren't going to just take your things, or else, how does stuff function well? And I think I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but on the podcast at least, but like in my opinion, like with regards to like kind of the more communist perspectives, is that it only really works if there's no scarcity, and we clearly have a lot of scarcity. So if everything is abundant, then it doesn't really matter. There's no incentive for me to take from you if I can already obtain the thing that you have, right? But if there is scarcity, then and there is nothing to protect what you have from me, and you have more than me, why wouldn't I just take what you have? Because I can. And then I think that's a pretty dangerous scenario, right? And I kind of think that private property is very important for a functional society. Um, and until we manage to solve the problem of scarcity, if we ever manage to solve the problem of scarcity, I don't really see how a traditionally communist society can work, um, like in without well, just I don't see how it can work as a communist society. Like, and to clarify that, in my opinion, the countries that are communist in the world are not real communist countries. They're just, you know, communist, if that makes sense. Like they do some
They're,
things communist, but they really aren't communist in
they're
functionality.
just communists, but with they're just capitalists with a communist Stalin mustache.
Yeah, pretty much. Like it's not like it's real. It's not like it's real communism. It's just like fake communism. It's like capitalist communism with a, you know, with a lot of corruption by and large.
Yeah. So what you said about the scarcity part, though, I think that it's hard for me to imagine a world like just with no scarcity whatsoever, right? Maybe like if we invent AI and it's like the singularity, and then AI would just take care of everything. But then you end up with like, you know, you ever seen Wall-E, right? Like all the like everyone's in those like pods and everyone's fat, and like there's I think that could be like a dystopian future as well, where there is no scarcity anymore, but like, you know, everyone just kind of like wastes away in their pot because they never have to work or they never have to do anything. And I just don't think that that's like even a very realistic thing to like be able to achieve in the first place. And this is just due to the law of thermodynamics, right? Which says that entropy is always going to increase. So in the amount of like disorder in the universe, it's going to naturally increase. But the things that we make, like, you know, there's a billion ways to arrange like the particles on this computer so that it's no longer a computer. If I take a hammer and I smash it, then I'm going to change the way the molecules arrange themselves, and it's not going to be a computer. But there's like, you know, an infinite amount of ways you can arrange it so that it's not a computer, but there's only certain ways that you can arrange the molecules so that it is a computer. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because that's what like production is, right? When we manufacture products and when we make services, we're lowering entropy, and that requires effort because the natural tendency of the universe is for entropy to go up. But in order to like actually produce things that are useful, we need to lower the entropy of the universe. So yeah, this is just kind of like a maybe like a scientist or like a physicist point of view of like why communism doesn't work, is because, as you said, it requires absolute non-scarcity, and it just doesn't follow the law of thermodynamics. It's just the natural tendency is just for things to be disordered and for resources to like be arranged in a way so that they're not useful, and we need
Yeah.
to do work to make them useful.
I think I'm also kind of thinking of like more of like the Star Trek kind of uh I don't know what the word is. Like how they have like the fabricators where they can basically make anything that they want with that, right? And that, you know, it's not super duper explained on how they can do that, but you know, functionally speaking, if you want a computer, you seem to be able to just beep bop boop computer outputs, right? And I think that's kind of more so what I'm thinking when I think of like they've defeated scarcity, is that you can kind of create anything you would want. And now the only problem with that is like even with Star Trek in mind, like there's been many examples in all the Star Trek episodes going back of like corruption and different levels of like Starfleet, etc. So it's like clearly it's not a fully functioning society either way in that regard. Like clearly you can't avoid the flaws of humans, even if you can fabricate everything with a beep bop boop. So I don't know. I don't have much faith in in the big red plan, I guess.